The Mongols' brutal treatment of captured women, worse than movies show. You've seen the sweeping cavalry charges on screen, the storm of arrows, the burning cities, and the great Khans portrayed as ruthless conquerors. But what you rarely see is what happened after the battles when the dust settled and the Mongols sifted through their captives. History often sanitizes this part of the story. Movies cut away or imply vague horrors without showing the real weight of what women endured. Yet in truth, what the Mongols did to captured women was worse than most people can imagine. Welcome to this channel, where we dive deep into the hidden history of sex, power, and conquest, uncovering the parts of the past that school books and cinema leave out. Today, we're opening a door most would rather keep closed. When the Mongols swept across Asia in the 13th century, they brought not only military devastation, but also an entirely new scale of human suffering. We think of conquest as territory gained, rulers toppled, and maps redrawn. But for the people actually caught in their path, especially women, it meant something far more personal, brutal, and lasting. Contemporary chronicles and first-hand accounts don't shy away from describing what the Mongols did. They were not conquerors who merely sought tribute and submission. They were destroyers, and women were treated as both spoils of war and tools for domination. Consider the fall of Nishapur in 1221. After fierce resistance, the Mongols massacred nearly the entire population. Historians say perhaps hundreds of thousands perished in that single event, their corpses piled into pyramids of skulls. And while the men were slaughtered, women were often deliberately spared. Not for mercy, but for a fate that many considered worse. Captured women became possessions, parceled out among soldiers, gifted to commanders, or sent back to the Mongol homeland. Some were enslaved in households, others forced into concubinage, and countless more subjected to systematic violence meant to break their spirit. In many ways, the battlefield was only the beginning of their ordeal. The Mongols believed that terror itself was a weapon, and they wielded it with precision. Their treatment of women was part of that strategy. Imagine word spreading to the next city, not just that the Mongols killed, but that they subjected women to unspeakable humiliation. The psychological weight of that knowledge often led entire towns to surrender without resistance, preferring subjugation to the fate they'd heard whispered about. In this way, women's suffering became a deliberate extension of the Mongol war machine, turning individual torment into collective fear. But this was not mindless cruelty. It was organized, systemic, and deeply tied to Mongol culture. The nomadic lifestyle of the steppe had long valued women for their roles within clan and family. But once the Mongols expanded outward, they viewed foreign women differently. Captives were stripped not just of freedom, but of identity. A noblewoman from Khwarezm might find herself reduced to serving in a yurt, forced to bear children for a man who had slaughtered her kin. Even the beauty of women was commodified. There are accounts of Mongols sorting captives, setting aside those deemed attractive for the highest-ranking commanders, while others were handed down the chain of soldiers like spoils from a hunt. What's striking is how openly medieval sources described this. Juvaini, a Persian chronicler, writes that the Mongols violated women in front of their families before killing them. European travelers, too, carried back tales of shocking degradation. Marco Polo, centuries later, hinted at the sexual excesses of the Mongol elite, their harems swollen with women taken from every corner of the empire. And behind every tale of conquest lies the silent reality of women forced into a life of endless fear, knowing their fate depended not on their choices but on the whims of men who saw them as trophies. What makes this even more chilling is how it was normalized. For the Mongols, war booty included livestock, gold, and women alike. To seize a woman was no different from seizing a herd of horses. It was part of what victory promised. And once this logic spread, cruelty was not a crime, but a rite of conquest. This normalization meant that young soldiers entering battle had expectations of what they'd receive, and women were part of that promise. The psychological effect on both sides was devastating. For the Mongols, it reinforced their culture of violence. For their enemies, it deepened the sense of despair. But beyond the immediate suffering, there was also a political dimension. Genghis Khan himself used marriage and concubinage as tools of diplomacy, often seizing noblewomen from conquered dynasties and marrying them into his own family to legitimize Mongol power. These unions were rarely consensual. They were symbolic gestures of dominance, binding the bloodlines of defeated rulers to the very empire that had destroyed them. Imagine being a queen one day and a concubine the next, stripped of your crown and forced into the bed of the man who had obliterated your kingdom. For ordinary women, the brutality was even starker. Many were taken on forced marches across vast distances, driven like cattle to camps where they were distributed. Survivors of these marches described how exhaustion, starvation, and abuse cut down the captives long before they reached their final destination. For those who made it, survival did not mean freedom. It meant servitude, violation, and the constant reminder of what had been lost. Children born of these unions carried the legacy of conquest in their very blood, often treated with suspicion by both Mongol and non-Mongol communities alike. Even in later generations, when the Mongol Empire had settled into dynasties like the Yuan in China or the Ilkhanate in Persia, the echoes of these practices lingered. Royal courts were filled with women of conquered origins, and harems remained symbols of Mongol dominance. The empire was built not only on cavalry charges, but on the backs of women whose suffering was a silent foundation. And while war always brings violence, the Mongols perfected a form of psychological warfare that weaponized women's bodies as tools of submission. So when we look back at those sweeping scenes in films, armies charging across the steppe, cities falling to fire, we're seeing only half the story. What the camera never lingers on is the silent aftermath, the women taken behind the smoke, whose lives became the unspoken cost of Mongol glory. Their stories are rarely told, but without them, we cannot truly understand the scale of Mongol brutality. Because the conquest of land was visible, but the conquest of women was hidden, whispered, and passed down in trauma rather than in maps. And it is here, in the unspoken shadows of history, that the true horror of the Mongol invasions comes to life. When we think of conquest, we often imagine it ending with the sword. But for the Mongols, conquest was only the beginning of another process: assimilation, exploitation, and distribution. Once a city had been burned, once resistance had been crushed, there remained the question of what to do with the living spoils. Women were at the very center of this question. They were not seen merely as individuals, but as resources, categorized, divided, and assigned in ways that reflected both the hierarchy of the Mongol army and the broader ambitions of the empire. Accounts describe how captured women were sorted, much like other forms of plunder. Young, attractive, or noble-born women were set aside for commanders, sometimes even earmarked for Genghis Khan himself or his direct family. These women might find themselves swept into the orbit of the great Khan's court, forced into roles as concubines or wives, depending on what was deemed useful. The more ordinary women, those without beauty or noble birth, were often distributed to the rank-and-file soldiers, absorbed into camps as laborers, cooks, and sexual property. This cold sorting process was not improvisation. It was systematic, a ritual of conquest that reinforced Mongol power. And here is where we see the complexity of the Mongol machine. For while most women faced exploitation and suffering, some were paradoxically elevated. Genghis Khan and his successors often married captured noblewomen to secure legitimacy over conquered lands. By taking the daughter of a defeated ruler as a wife, the Mongol Khan could symbolically graft her bloodline onto his own, turning enemies into subjects and dynasties into branches of the Mongol tree. To outsiders, these unions might have looked like acts of diplomacy, but to the women themselves they were acts of erasure. Their identities as queens or princesses were stripped away, replaced with the identity of captive, wife, or concubine. Within the Mongol court, the harem became a powerful institution. It was not merely a collection of women for pleasure, but a political apparatus. Women within the harem could bear sons who, by Mongol custom, had claims to inheritance and succession. This meant that some captive women, through no choice of their own, found themselves mothers to princes and even empresses of the empire. Their fate was contradictory. On one hand, they wielded influence, whispering in the ears of powerful men. On the other, they were always haunted by the violence that had brought them into that position. To be elevated was not to be free. It was simply to be bound in a golden cage rather than a wooden one. For most, though, the fate was far darker. Women absorbed into Mongol households became slaves in every sense of the word. They performed endless labor, tending livestock, preparing food, caring for children who were not their own. And all the while, they lived under the shadow of sexual coercion. Women who resisted were often killed, a fate considered merciful compared to the prolonged suffering of compliance. Entire generations of women were raised in this system, growing up in Mongol camps far from their homelands, never again seeing the cities and families from which they had been torn. Their very identities dissolved into anonymity, remembered in history not by name but only as part of an uncounted mass of captives. There were also women forced into roles that went beyond domestic slavery. Some were turned into entertainers, compelled to dance, sing, or amuse their captors. Others were given as gifts, traded between commanders, or sent to allied tribes as symbols of goodwill. A woman could be marched across thousands of miles, passed from hand to hand, her life a token of political convenience. In such cases, her fate was doubly cruel. She was not only stripped of freedom but also transformed into currency. Her body became a bargaining chip, traded for loyalty, horses, or safe passage. And yet, within this darkness, some women found ways to navigate the system. History records instances where concubines and wives gained remarkable influence. The most famous was Turagena Khatun, widow of Genghis Khan, who served as regent of the Mongol Empire after his death. Though her power was real, it existed only because she had borne sons and maneuvered within the dangerous politics of the court. For every Turagena who rose to prominence, there were countless thousands who remained nameless, their stories lost to the silence of history. The exceptions highlight the rule. The Mongol system was designed to strip women of agency, and only in rare cases could one claw it back. What's most chilling is how normalized all this became within Mongol society. To the victors, there was no shame in taking captives, no stigma in reducing women to prizes. It was expected, celebrated even, as proof of the empire's strength. A young warrior who returned with women as booty was not condemned, he was honored. This created a generational cycle where violence against women was woven into the very fabric of Mongol identity. And the more it became normalized, the less space there was for anyone to question it. The psychological toll on the women themselves is harder to trace because they rarely had the chance to record their experiences. We hear their voices only indirectly, through the accounts of men, Persian chroniclers, Chinese scribes, European travelers, who described what they witnessed. Yet even through these second-hand records, the despair is unmistakable. Women forced into Mongol camps often chose death rather than endure what awaited them. Some threw themselves into rivers, others killed their children to spare them the life of a captive. These desperate acts remind us that behind every dry statistic, 10,000 captives taken, 100 women given as tribute, there were individual lives, each one facing decisions no human being should ever be forced to make. In this way, the Mongol conquest was not only a physical invasion but a cultural one. By tearing women from their families, repurposing them into roles of concubine, slave, or pawn, the Mongols fractured the social fabric of every region they conquered. Families were destroyed, lineages broken, and entire communities left scarred. The conquest of women became a conquest of memory, ensuring that the trauma lasted long after the Mongol armies had ridden on. And so, while the story of Mongol warfare is often told in terms of strategy and speed, how their cavalry outmaneuvered their enemies, how their tactics reshaped medieval warfare, the real story cannot be separated from what happened behind the lines. The distribution of women was as much a part of Mongol conquest as the arrows and siege engines. It was a quieter war, fought not on open fields but in the shadows of tents and palaces, leaving wounds invisible to the eye but carved deep into the hearts of those who endured it. What makes the Mongols stand out in history is not only what they did to women, but how their treatment resonated in comparison to other societies of the time. To be clear, brutality against women was tragically common in medieval warfare. Armies across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia often sacked cities and subjected women to abuse. Yet even within this dark norm, the Mongols provoked an almost unparalleled sense of dread. Chroniclers from vastly different regions, Muslim, Christian, Chinese, Persian, all record the same impression. The Mongols' treatment of women carried a scale and a systematic nature that was worse than what they had ever seen. Take the example of Crusader armies in the Levant. They too were guilty of violating captives, of turning women into loot. But their violence was often chaotic, a byproduct of undisciplined soldiers looting a fallen city. With the Mongols, by contrast, it was organized. Women were not simply assaulted in the heat of the moment. They were deliberately sorted, parceled, and distributed as if they were part of the empire's logistics. This was not madness in the aftermath of battle. It was cold policy, rooted in the Mongol belief that conquest entitled them to absolute ownership over the conquered. In the Islamic world, jihad warfare sometimes followed similar patterns, with women seized as concubines or slaves. But even there, religious law imposed at least theoretical limits. Rules existed, however poorly enforced, about how captives should be treated, about the rights of concubines, about prohibitions against certain abuses. The Mongols had no such limits. Their worldview was not shaped by a universalizing religion with written codes, but by the law of the steppe, where victory justified everything. To a Mongol warrior, if a city resisted, its women and children belonged to him by right. There was no authority to restrain him, no cleric to condemn him, no written law to forbid him. The Chinese dynasties too had long-standing practices of concubinage and forced marriages in times of war. Yet Chinese chronicles are unanimous in their horror at the Mongols. When the Jin dynasty collapsed under Mongol invasion, entire populations were subjected to enslavement. The number of women taken was so vast that Chinese writers described the aftermath as if entire provinces had been drained of their female population. These accounts often emphasize that while Chinese dynasties in the past had engaged in war, they had not annihilated on the same scale, nor reduced women to this level of commodification. Perhaps most striking are the comparisons made by Europeans who encountered Mongol power for the first time. When news of the Mongols reached Europe in the 1240s, the stories that filtered back were laced with a recurring theme: women's suffering. Hungarian and Polish chroniclers wrote not just of massacres but of women seized and carried east, vanishing into the steppe never to be seen again. For Christian Europe, which was already familiar with the violence of crusades, the Mongols stood out as something other, something beyond the pale. They were described not as ordinary conquerors but as a scourge, a punishment unleashed on humanity. What shocked contemporaries was not only the violence, but the deliberate humiliation. Sources describe Mongols violating women in front of their families, desecrating the very fabric of kinship and honor. In societies where family honor was paramount, this was not just a physical assault, but a social death. It destroyed not only the woman's sense of self, but also her family's standing. In this way, the Mongols weaponized women's bodies to dismantle the very structures that held communities together. Other armies might take women as plunder, but the Mongols turned the act itself into a form of psychological warfare, amplifying the terror that preceded their arrival. There's also the matter of scale. A Mongol conquest did not mean dozens of women taken. It often meant tens of thousands. Cities like Merv, Nishapur, and Samarkand were depopulated. Their surviving women carried away in numbers so large that they changed the demographics of entire regions. The mass transfer of women was so vast that genetic studies today show the mark of Mongol conquests in populations across Eurasia. The infamous claim that 1 in 200 men alive today descends from Genghis Khan may be debated, but the very fact that it seems plausible speaks to the enormous number of unions, often coerced, that took place in the wake of Mongol campaigns. When compared to the norms of medieval warfare then, the Mongols were not unique in committing atrocities against women, but they were unique in how systematic, vast, and normalized those atrocities became. Their empire institutionalized the practice, embedding it into the very machinery of conquest. For soldiers, the promise of women was part of the motivation to fight. For commanders, the redistribution of captives was part of the reward system. For the Khans, the taking of noblewomen was a tool of legitimacy. In this way, women were woven into every level of Mongol expansion, from the humblest soldier's tent to the palace of the great Khan. It's important to note that not all Mongols viewed this as brutality. To them, it was simply the order of things. Steppe culture had long valued conquest as the highest form of achievement, and in that worldview, taking women was as natural as taking livestock. It was only when their empire collided with agricultural civilizations, Persians, Chinese, Russians, Europeans, that the scale of their practices provoked horror. What others saw as barbarism, they saw as custom. This cultural gap magnified the sense of dread, as conquered peoples realized that the Mongols operated under a moral code utterly alien to their own. Yet for the women themselves, this distinction hardly mattered. Whether their captors viewed them as spoils or symbols, the result was the same: a life shattered, a body no longer their own, a future stolen. The comparisons with other powers highlight the uniqueness of Mongol methods, but at the core, they reveal a universal truth about medieval warfare, that women were almost always the silent victims, their suffering recorded only when it became too massive to ignore. The Mongols, however, ensured that their treatment of women could not be ignored. They used it deliberately, systematically, and at such scale that it became central to their legend. The name of Genghis Khan inspired fear not just because of cavalry charges and sieges, but because his armies left behind generations of women, marked forever by violence. This, perhaps more than any military tactic, explains why cities surrendered before a single arrow was shot. They knew what awaited them if they resisted, and it was not just death but degradation. And so, when we place the Mongols alongside other medieval powers, the contrast sharpens. Where others committed atrocities, the Mongols built a system out of them. Where others looted chaotically, the Mongols looted methodically. Where others violated women as an ugly side effect of war, the Mongols transformed it into a strategy of conquest. It is this systematization, this cold, deliberate normalization that makes their brutality stand out even centuries later, echoing across chronicles that still struggle to capture the full horror of what was endured. The echoes of the Mongol invasions did not fade when the armies moved on. For the women who survived, the consequences stretched not just through their own lifetimes, but across generations, embedding scars in families, cultures, and even in the genetic fabric of populations. The horror was not only immediate, it was enduring, reshaping the way entire regions remembered themselves. If battles ended in days or weeks, the aftermath for women lingered for centuries. Imagine a town emptied of its men, its elders executed, its soldiers slaughtered. What remained were women and children, and the Mongols took them. The women were absorbed into Mongol camps or sold into slavery across the vast trade networks that their empire commanded. Some ended up in Persia, others in China, still others carried westward into the lands of the Golden Horde. The Mongol conquest scattered women like seeds on the wind, and their stories were carried far from their homelands. This uprooting tore holes in communities. Families disappeared from records, dynasties collapsed, and whole regions found their identities fractured. One of the most lasting effects was demographic. Contemporary accounts speak of depopulated cities, of provinces where women were carried off in such numbers that the balance between male and female populations was permanently altered. Archaeological evidence and genetic studies suggest that the Mongol invasions left behind lasting marks on the gene pool of Eurasia. Generations later, children born of forced unions tied together bloodlines that had once been separated by vast distances. These genetic traces are silent witnesses to the violence, showing how conquest inscribed itself into human DNA. But the impact was not only biological, it was psychological and cultural. Across the Islamic world, the Mongol invasions became synonymous with destruction. Persian poets and chroniclers wrote of cities drenched in blood and of women dishonored, their laments carried forward in literature long after the events themselves. These stories became part of the cultural memory, repeated across centuries as reminders of vulnerability and loss. To this day, in parts of Central Asia and the Middle East, the word Mongol retains a shadow of terror. its historical weight shaped as much by what happened to women as by the military defeats. In China, too, memory of Mongol rule was colored by stories of humiliation. When the Yuan dynasty collapsed, Ming chroniclers painted the Mongols as foreign oppressors who had not only conquered the empire, but defiled its women. This narrative helped unify resistance and justify rebellion, ensuring that Mongol brutality became more than just history. It became a cautionary tale. The figure of the violated woman stood as a symbol for the violated nation, her suffering magnified into a collective wound. Even in Europe, where direct Mongol rule was limited, the stories that spread created a kind of cultural trauma. Chroniclers described women carried away eastward, their voices lost in foreign lands. For Europeans, the fear of the Mongols was entwined with the fear of women disappearing into the unknown, swallowed by the vastness of Asia. These tales contributed to the image of the Mongols as a biblical scourge, a people sent by God to punish humanity. And at the core of that myth was the treatment of women, which seemed to Europeans the ultimate proof of Mongol godlessness. The personal consequences for the women themselves were devastating. Survivors often carried the memory of violence in silence, unable to speak of what had been done to them. In patriarchal societies, shame and stigma compounded their suffering. A woman who returned to her community after captivity might be seen not as a victim but as tainted, her place in family and society forever altered. Some were cast out, others forced into marriages where their past was never spoken of but always present. The psychological scars were unrecorded, but they shaped lives in ways that history can only hint at. Children born of conquest bore their own burdens. In Mongol households, sons of concubines sometimes rose to power, but more often these children occupied an ambiguous space. Were they Mongol or foreign? Were they heirs or outsiders? Their mixed heritage was a reminder of violence, and they often grew up between worlds. In the lands conquered, children born of rape were sometimes rejected, seen as symbols of defeat. This dual rejection reinforced the generational impact, ensuring that the trauma of women's suffering did not end with them, but continued through their offspring. Over time, the cultural memory of Mongol brutality shaped how societies thought about women, conquest, and vulnerability. In Persia and Central Asia, stories of Mongol atrocities became cautionary tales told to instill fear and obedience. In Russia, the period of Mongol domination, the so-called Mongol yoke, was remembered as a time of humiliation, and tales of women carried off became part of national identity. These stories endured not because they were unique, but because they captured a truth that people could not forget: that women's suffering was central to the experience of conquest. Even within Mongol society, the long-term effects were visible. The empire's harems grew into complex institutions where women of every ethnicity mingled: Chinese, Persian, Russian, Central Asian, forming a kind of forced cosmopolitanism. This created cultural exchanges, but under conditions of coercion. Languages, customs, and traditions blended, not through voluntary marriage or trade, but through the suffering of women carried across continents. The Mongol Empire, for all its brutality, also created new cultural syntheses, and women were the unwilling conduits of that process. Yet perhaps the most haunting legacy is the silence. For every chronicler who described Mongol atrocities, there were countless women whose voices were never heard. Their stories exist only in fragments, hinted at in laments, in rumors, in the margins of history. This silence itself is a form of trauma, a reminder of how violence against women often disappears from the record. What we know is already terrible, but what we do not know, the unrecorded suffering of millions, is even more staggering. And so, the long-term consequences of Mongol brutality cannot be measured only in numbers or chronicles. They are felt in the way societies remember, in the way women's bodies became battlegrounds for identity and honor, in the way trauma was passed down silently through generations. The Mongols may have built the largest land empire in history, but beneath their triumphs lies a shadow empire of grief, carried in the memories of women whose lives were stolen, altered, or erased. As we move further into this story, it becomes clear that the brutality was not just a chapter of the past, it is a thread woven into the history of nations, still echoing in cultural memory today. And that memory tells us something essential, that conquest is never only about armies and rulers. It is also about the silent suffering of those who could not resist, whose pain was hidden behind the smoke of burning cities. As we reach the final chapter of this story, it is worth pausing to reflect on what we have uncovered. The Mongols. Treatment of captured women was more than just incidental brutality. It was integral to the empire's expansion, its culture, and its enduring legacy. From the first raids on the steppes to the vast empires carved across Eurasia, women were central to the machinery of conquest, used both as tools of domination and symbols of triumph. Their suffering was not collateral damage. It was a deliberate strategy, a fact that history often glosses over or reduces to a footnote. It is striking how these practices intersected with sexuality, power, and politics. The Mongols were not unique in exploiting women after conquest, but the scale, organization, and psychological intention behind their actions were exceptional. Captured women became concubines, laborers, political pawns, and sometimes even mothers of princes, navigating a world where survival often depended on submission. Their bodies were weaponized, their lives redirected by force, and their fates intertwined with the rise of one of history's largest empires. The complexity of this reality challenges the simplified portrayals we see in films or even popular history books. Battles are cinematic, but the aftermath, the system of exploitation, coercion, and forced assimilation, is far more difficult to depict and far more harrowing. Consider the human cost. Cities emptied of their populations, women marched across continents, and families broken beyond repair. These experiences shaped societies, influencing marriage patterns, cultural memory, and demographic structures for generations. The children born of these unions, often forced, rarely welcomed, were living legacies of violence, reminders that conquest did not end with the fall of a city but continued in daily life for those who survived. The Mongol Empire may have collapsed centuries ago, but the shadows of its sexual politics and the trauma inflicted upon women lingered far longer. Even the women who were elevated within Mongol society, those rare concubines or wives who gained influence, did so at the cost of enormous personal sacrifice. Their positions were precarious, reliant on political maneuvering, submission, and the ability to navigate the capricious desires of the elite. In some ways, this paradox highlights a chilling reality. Power and trauma were intertwined. For a woman to survive, she had to leverage her body, intelligence, and patience, yet her autonomy remained circumscribed by an empire that had first taken her by force. This duality, privilege born from coercion, reminds us of the complexity of sexual power dynamics in historical contexts, and how history often rewards survival without acknowledging the cost. The Mongols' treatment of women also forces us to rethink the nature of historical memory. When we study armies, empires, and battles, we often focus on strategy, conquest, and leadership. Yet the fate of women reveals another dimension entirely, one that intertwines social structures, sexuality, and systemic oppression. Women were not passive observers. They were central to the functioning of the empire even when their participation was coerced. Their lives shaped political outcomes, cultural synthesis, and even succession, proving that understanding history fully requires confronting the aspects that are often hidden, uncomfortable, or intentionally minimized. From a modern perspective, it is impossible not to feel a mix of shock and sorrow. The Mongols were pragmatic, organized, and extraordinarily brutal. Their policies toward women were carefully calculated to maximize control, terror, and consolidation of power. Yet in the historical record, the focus often remains on generals, cavalry, and sieges, while the experiences of women remain peripheral. Bringing their stories into focus is not simply an act of moral reckoning. It is essential to understanding the full scope of history. Without it, we see only part of the truth, a sanitized narrative that obscures the cost of empire. This is where history meets the modern fascination with sexuality, power, and hidden stories. Exploring what happened to women during Mongol conquests sheds light not only on the past but also on broader patterns of human behavior. It reveals how societies have used sexual violence as a tool of control, how conquest has intertwined with intimacy, and how trauma can echo across generations. By examining these histories openly and analytically, we gain insight into both the resilience of survivors and the mechanisms of domination that have shaped societies for centuries. And yet, amidst the horror, there is a lesson in resilience. Despite the systematic violence, countless women survived, adapted, and even found ways to influence the world around them. Their voices, often suppressed or mediated through male chroniclers, still whisper across the centuries, reminding us that human beings endure even in the face of unimaginable cruelty. Their stories challenge us to confront history honestly, to acknowledge suffering without sensationalizing it, and to recognize the hidden contributions and sacrifices of those who are too often forgotten. As we reflect on this history, it is worth asking ourselves which facts resonate most. Was it the sheer scale of women taken from their homes, the systematic distribution into households and harems, the long-term demographic and cultural consequences that spread across continents, or the paradox of power within captivity, where some women were elevated, yet remained bound? Each of these truths adds a layer of understanding to a period that, while often reduced to cinematic spectacle, was profoundly human, profoundly complex, and profoundly tragic. So as we conclude this journey into the hidden history of the Mongols and their treatment of women, consider what has surprised you the most. Was it the organization of captivity, the use of women as political tools, or the echoes of trauma that persisted for generations? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We want to hear which parts of history shocked you, fascinated you, or changed the way you see conquest and power. And if you found this video illuminating, subscribe to the channel for more explorations into the hidden, often overlooked stories of sex, sexuality, and human experience throughout history. Because history is not only about what happened, it's about what we notice, what we remember, and what we choose to uncover. The Mongols may have conquered vast empires with cavalry and strategy, but their treatment of women leaves a legacy that is harder to measure, impossible to ignore, and essential to understanding the full story of human history. By exploring it, we honor the silenced voices and ensure that their experiences, though long buried, are finally seen, remembered, and reflected upon.